why we don't want to just look at the appeal to nature that, well, our ancestors ate that way. What's the disconnect there?
It just comes back to realizing what the goal of our ancestors was and what evolution is. It's to get you to an age to procreate. Evolution does not care if you have a heart attack at 60. If your goal is to increase the number of years that you live in good health, you're trying to shrink the number of years where you're affected by disease, then you have to look to the science that is studying people over time and looking at biomarkers that predict longevity. Right, because we have different goals to our ancestors.
Yes.
We're not just here to survive.
That was my friend Simon Hill, nutritionist and host of the Proof podcast, who sat down with me to break down today's most popular diets and trends. It can be confusing to navigate what dietary patterns are optimal for our longevity and health. With a master's degree in nutrition, Simon has a healthy obsession with nutritional science and helps clear the mud on this topic.
The data on fiber is really clear. There's a dose-dependent relationship. The more fiber you have, the lower risk of colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes, various forms of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and people are living longer. If you're interested in good health later in life, we have to look beyond speculation of what our ancestors may or may not have eaten. That's the other thing to consider here when we're thinking about like eating like our ancestors. Are we truly eating like them, or are we kind of eating the foods that we want to eat today and making ourselves feel good by telling ourselves that that's the same foods that they ate a long time ago?
He explains the hierarchy of evidence to establish which science holds more weight than others, why what's natural isn't necessarily the best for our long-term health, the truth about saturated fat, and the demonization of PUFAs in our diet. And we cover popular diets from paleo to Western A price, nourishing tradition style diets, keto, carnivore, plant paradox, and break down popular claims about butter, bone broth, anti-nutrients, seed oils, and more. While science is not perfect, we do have clear biomarkers for longevity and preventing our number one killers. And this episode goes into how these trends stack up against those markers. They have charts showing the increase in PUFA consumption shows an increase in these types of diseases. How do you respond to that? Simon published a best-selling book, which I highly recommend. The Proof is in the Plants. With so many experts letting their biases get in the way to form nutritional recommendations, Simon is the nutritional resource we need right now. He steers clear of dogma, something that very few people do, and is simply interested in the best evidence of the truth.
They're not appreciating that they can feel good today and still be increasing their risk of disease in decades to come, because these things bubble away under the surface.
Can you share your dietary thesis philosophy with everyone so they kind of know where we're coming from?
Okay. Starting with the big question. So I guess I probably have a philosophy or a dietary approach that is a little bit different to what may be more common in certain diet sort of groups or tribes, where people often sort of promote one diet as being the absolute optimal for human health. There's a little bit more kind of nuance in the position that I take, which is less absolute in nature. It means it's harder to sell. It's a little bit less of a sexy position to kind of take, and I understand that, but it's more in line with what the science shows. And that's my aim with everything that I do, is to kind of, I hold myself to a very high degree of accountability when it comes to rigorously looking at the evidence and presenting it as objectively as possible, irrespective of my chosen diet. And when you look at the evidence, there is not a single diet, and this is why there's so much argument online. There is no evidence that you can point to that would say this is definitively the single absolute best way for every human to eat for good health today and for good long-term health. But what is clear, and that often when people hear that, they think, well, does that mean we have no idea? No, we have a very good idea, but it's more of a theme or set of characteristics. And that theme, that time and time again has been shown to reduce risk of a lot of the chronic disease burden that is really robbing people of quality of life today: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, various types of cancers, Alzheimer's, dementia, etc. That theme that reduces the risk of all of those conditions is a diet that's low in saturated fat. It has a bias for unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats. I think that's something we're probably going to talk about.
Definitely.
It's rich in fiber, and it's low in ultra-processed foods, right? And those are probably like the big kind of three things as well as being low or hopefully excluding trans fats, which I think everyone agrees on today. Now, so that's very broad. What can that look like? It can be a very healthy, well thought out Mediterranean diet. It could be a pescatarian diet. It could be a vegetarian diet. It could be a very well planned whole food plant-based diet. These are all different variations of that theme. And I think that rather than that being, even though it's less absolute, rather than that being a negative thing, is actually quite positive, because it gives people choice based on what is going to be sustainable for them. Because the most important thing is, when we're considering particularly someone's long-term health, is what is a dietary pattern, a way of eating that they can stick to over time. And having more options means that more people are likely to be successful. And we're failing massively when you look at what the average diet looks like. So we need options. And then when we start to consider other aspects of our life and our values, the health of the planet, which is inextricably tied to our own health, and we think about animal welfare, that's where, and in my book, and this comes back to your original question about my thesis, that's where I think the case becomes much stronger to adopt a diet that's as plant exclusive as possible for you. And so, in a nutshell, that's kind of what my overall thesis is.
Amazing. And why have you become so passionate about this? Why do you read so much science?
When I was a little boy, I would come home and there'd be scientific papers littered all around the home.
No way.
My dad's now been a professor for, I think, 35 years going on, still to this day, and has been tremendously successful professor of physiology and publishing in Cell and Metabolism and all the major journals. So from a very early age, I was surrounded by studies, and I knew my dad was had done his PhD and was spending a lot of time in the lab. I'd go in and spend time with him. My dad would be wearing a white lab coat and had like microscopes, and I'd jump up and use the microscopes. And so I developed an appreciation for what science is as a tool. And it really is just a tool to help us better understand the world. And through that, we can make better decisions. It's not perfect, and science is about reducing uncertainty. And I think that can kind of make some people feel uncomfortable because they're looking for the definitive certain answer. But really, over time, what we're trying to do with the evidence base is progressively move closer to a truth, right? With, respect to whatever, topic that we're interested in. So I was kind of surrounded in that environment growing up and always thought, this is pretty cool. This is something that I'd like to explore. And then I finished high school and did an undergraduate science degree, and then later on did a master's in nutrition science. And really what fascinates me is when I look at kind of wellness culture and nutrition online, there's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of absolute positions, and there's a lot of people that are very, very confident in those positions. And it's actually, if you're going to be really confident in a position, whether it's, something about antinutrients, or it's about source of protein, or it's about fiber, there's so much time that needs to be invested into each of those topics. Literally, just to understand anti-nutrients, we could be talking about months of research getting across. And I'm quite, I think it's healthy, but I'm quite obsessed with like looking through that literature, and so I kind of feel like a lot of people are forming very strong positions without having done that work, and inherently, or just accepting a position because it kind of suits a bias that someone has.
Or it sounds good, like, oh, this makes sense. It must be right.
And we do that when it fits with a bias. So if we've adopted a particular diet, or we've had a sort of N=1 personal experience with something, we can then go looking for evidence to support that. But that's really the reverse direction of what we should be doing. We should be starting with the evidence base, sorting it out, filtering through what's mechanistic, what's the strongest evidence, and what are the converging lines? What's it all pointing to? That's how we actually look at things through a more evidence-based lens. Our anecdotal experience is important. I wouldn't say it's invalid, but there's a lot of blind spots there. So over the years, I've become incredibly passionate about trying to educate people about the actual evidence base, looking at nutrition, and helping people understand how I come to my conclusions. And also, if there's a claim that's out there, what's wrong with, or why would we not accept that claim? And often you can look at sort of logical inconsistencies. Someone's taking a certain position on something here, and then for another food or nutrient, they're taking a very different approach to how they're looking at the evidence. So, I just find it the whole process of looking at the evidence base and trying to communicate it and help people understand the principles, really interesting and rewarding.
Yeah. It's a really interesting topic to navigate. Like, is it only science that dictates what's the truth, or do you use other facets? Because I think a lot of these diets or trends that we're going to be talking about today, a lot of people take the approach of either it makes sense just in their head, or biology or nature's appeal. And then, like you said, looking for evidence that supports that bias. But do you at all use any of that, or is it just science to form your opinions?
Well, anthropology is a form of science, and biology and mechanisms are a form of science. So they certainly come into it. But you're right. I think there's a lot of kind of the naturalistic fallacy out there that a lot of people subscribe to. And I think that's a bit of a trap. I think that if we were to just live quote unquote naturally, I'm of the view that that would not lead to the most optimal lifespan and health span. And so I think it could be actually a very miserable life if all you did was try and live as naturally as possible. Think about the extent to which you would need to do that. So yeah, I sort of look at some of those things as interesting, like what did our ancestors eat? And you can look at that and you can deduce some.
Recently, I've been working with friend of the pod, Dr. Will Bolsowitz, on his new brand, 38 Terra, an evidence-based prebiotic supplement to optimize gut health. To facilitate online sales, 38 Terra uses Shopify. The major reason 38 Terra chose Shopify over other e-commerce platforms was because of Shopify's focus on customer conversion. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading e-commerce platforms. If you're going to spend time and money on marketing, you want to make sure you are converting the people who visit your site into loyal customers. What I also love about Shopify is how, no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control in-house. The Shopify App Store is home to thousands of customizable apps that can easily plug into your website to help with things like upselling, selling products on social media channels like Instagram and TikTok, and much more. To boost your conversion rate and grow your business, sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/proof. That's shopify.com/proof, all in lowercase.
There are a number of pitfalls with those arguments as well. Our ancestors, for example, were eating to survive. That's what evolution is worried about, getting you to an age to procreate, maybe a little bit beyond that. And so they were choosing foods in the environment, the foods that were available to them to help them survive. That doesn't speak to the types of things that I'm necessarily interested in, or a lot of my community and listeners are interested in, which is how can they get to 60, 70, and 80 and not develop a certain type of cancer, or not develop heart disease, or not have a stroke? How can they actually just enjoy their life for longer? And so, anthropology and what our ancestors ate can only kind of tell us so much. And even then, I don't think there is one ancestral diet. I think the evidence is pretty clear that it varied a lot over time. So how far back are we going to go? What geographical location? There's a lot of kind of variables and speculation there.
Yeah. Right now, the term ancestral is extremely trendy. And yet, if you do call it trendy, people can kind of get upset. Like, no, it's not. It's ancestral. It's what it is. But really, like you said, how far back do you want to go? There's so many different types of ancestral diets. So how are you deciding which type of ancestral diet is the best for you? Paleo, nourishing traditions type style. We have keto, carnivore, all that stuff. A lot of it is kind of lumped, like you've said before, under an umbrella term of ancestral.
Yeah, I think firstly, we probably should acknowledge that there are a number of good things about those diets. And the big obvious one is that they're focused on whole foods and not ultra processed, highly palatable, energy dense, refined sugar and fat dense foods. Mm-hmm. And it is those ultra processed foods that make up, 60% of the average person's calories. They're driving, an enormous amount of the overweight, obesity sort of epidemic that we see, which is then linked to a lot of the poor metabolic health that we see, whether it's type 2 diabetes or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Those types of metabolic conditions are pretty much entirely driven by energy toxicity, consuming too many calories. And so as soon as you take these ultra processed foods off the table, we all know when you're focused on whole foods, you tend to eat much less calories. And that's been shown, in clinical studies, really high level studies. Kevin Hall at the NIH did a study looking at a unprocessed whole food diet versus an ultra processed food diet. And he actually matched in the foods protein and fat and sugars and even fiber. Mm. And he had these people basically locked up in a metabolic ward. Mm-hmm. And it was an ad libitum study, which means you can eat as much as you want, eat until you're satisfied. And the great thing about that is you can get a feel for satiety. Mm-hmm. How full were people? Were people filling up on one of those diets earlier and eating less calories? Mm-hmm. And it was a crossover study. So if you were in this study, you got to do the unprocessed diet for a couple of weeks and then you'd switch over, and people did it in different orders. So it's considered a very high quality type of study. And on average, when people were eating the ultra processed diet, even though they matched for those different factors, which doesn't happen in the real world, they were eating 500 calories more per day.
It makes complete sense.
So, right off the bat here, we can say, like, if someone's adopting a diet that is quote unquote ancestral, whichever variation it might be, there are some subtle differences between these different dietary patterns, and some I think are better than others. But straight away, that's going to lead to many people losing weight, which leads to many health improvements and improvements in biomarkers that predict disease, whether that's their fasting glucose or their triglycerides, things of blood pressure, things of that nature. So I think that's a big tick for these diets. And something that we kind of overlook is like the agreement between people coming at nutrition from different angles. There's 60% of someone's calories. Where I think these diets get a few things wrong is back to that theme that I mentioned at the start. I said it de-emphasizes saturated fat. It has more of an emphasis on polyunsaturated fats. And there's a couple of really important reasons for that. One is, in the literature, it's very clear that when you swap calories from saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat, we see an improvement in a number of important biomarkers. We see an improvement in LDL cholesterol, more specifically ApoB, if anyone's kind of familiar with that, essentially the same sort of thing, or telling us a similar information. And we also see an improvement in insulin sensitivity, so your body's ability to shuttle glucose into cells and use it. And in the context of someone who is eating excess calories, and a lot of people are eating excess calories. You can eat an ancestral diet and still be eating excess calories. In the context of eating above what your daily energy requirements are, if you're gaining weight on an ancestral diet with a lot of saturated fat, you can bet, and it will vary depending on your genetics, but you can bet it's not just subcutaneous fat under your skin, on your face or your hips or wherever. It's going to be visceral fat. We know that saturated fat really drives up the fat in the liver and also in the pancreas. There's clinical trial after clinical trial showing that. Whereas when you swap those calories from saturated fat for polyunsaturated fats, you see a reduction in this very harmful ectopic fat, is what it's called scientifically, in the liver and in the pancreas. So one of the things that I kind of almost laugh at is within these crowds, they often promote these diets as best for metabolic health.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue very strongly that that's not true. The liver is the master regulator of essentially of your metabolic health and metabolism. And if you're increasing the fat levels in the liver and in the pancreas, you are increasing insulin resistance. You're reducing your body's ability to utilize glucose. And so if you think about metabolism and metabolic health broadly, my definition would be that you're really good at being able to utilize fats and carbohydrates. That's true metabolic flexibility. But if you're eating in a way that is making you really poor at utilizing carbohydrates, I would argue that you're actually shifting your metabolic health in an unfavorable direction. So that would be kind of like one of the major disagreements between myself and someone who's putting forward a more sort of ancestral diet.
Would that be specific to like keto and carnivore, where they're not eating fruits and potatoes and things like that? Or are you also speaking that to someone who eats quote unquote ancestrally, but they're eating a wide variety of fruits and
so there's a
potatoes?
bit of nuance here for us to explore, and maybe we can kind of step through that. But this is also an area that trips people up. So when I'm using the word saturated fat right now, and I've been doing that kind of purposefully to keep it high level, but if we want to step to that next level deeper, saturated fat's an umbrella term. So not all saturated fats are the same. When we're reviewing the evidence to look at is something healthy or harmful, we have to be really specific. So what type of saturated fats are we talking about? How much? If someone was replacing those saturated fats, what are they replacing it with? And for whom? What are their genetics?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all of these make a really big difference. Does it vary based on those different diets? It depends on where someone's getting their saturated fats from. We know like saturated fats that are found in red meat and also in butter tend to drive LDL cholesterol and ApoB up quite a lot. Much more than the saturated fats in dairy. So you can go and look at a study, and there's one, Chen et al. Has done a meta-analysis, which is often cited, which shows that the saturated fats in dairy compared to red meat, sorry, when I say dairy, I'm not talking about butter, I'm talking about the other forms of dairy. Those saturated fats in yogurt and in cheese do not increase LDL cholesterol ApoB as much as red meat does. Mm. And you could point to that study and say, see, look, dairy's positive for cholesterol. Well, relative to red meat it is. But in that same study, they also looked at, well, how do those saturated fats in dairy compare to polyunsaturated fats in plant foods? And you see a step, again, a beneficial step by swapping calories from dairy, milk and cheese for these plant fats. So compared to what is like really important when we're trying to dig into this research and make sense of it, my kind of take home message here for the listener, because how do you make sense of all of that? They just want to know, okay, but I just want to know, like, is the saturated fat in my diet, is it a problem?
Yeah.
Go and measure your ApoB level.
So what is ApoB? I think a lot of people don't know what that is. Can you explain it?
We've spoken about the two energy sources so far, glucose and fats. And most people probably realize that sugar just kind of freely flows in circulation. It's water soluble, and our plasma in our blood is mostly water. So we don't have to have something that kind of chaperones or carries glucose. It can just dissolve in, move through circulation, and go to cells. We cannot do the same with fats, right? Fats are water insoluble. So through evolution, our body had to come up with an answer. How are we going to get these fats to our cells? And what it does is a protein, which is water soluble, you can almost imagine like a beach ball. Imagine that the outside of that is the protein, which is water soluble. And we're going to stuff the fats in the middle of that. And now that can go into circulation and it can dissolve. And then we can carry that through the blood and hopefully get it to the tissues that need it. Another actually analogy here that can be helpful for people to kind of think about is a cargo ship. Like a cargo ship that's carrying different containers, across the sea, right? The cargo ship you can think about as the protein. And on top of that, those containers are cholesterol and triglycerides, fats. There's essentially two different families of these cargo ships. One of them is called ApoB, and the other one's called ApoA1. We don't need to think about ApoA1 right now. These ApoB containing lipoproteins, which is what they're called, all of them have the capacity, as they're floating through circulation, to enter the artery wall, get retained, cause inflammation, and build up as fatty plaque. 90% of ApoB containing lipoproteins are LDL, low density lipoproteins.
Mm-hmm.
The other 10% are called IDL and VLDLs. When you measure your ApoB directly, you get the summation of LDL plus IDL plus VLDL. Okay. So you get, and this is particularly important for about 20% of the population where LDL cholesterol doesn't correlate with ApoB. You get a much better idea of your risk of cardiovascular disease by going and requesting ApoB, or if that's not available to someone, they're on standard blood tests. Usually you can get non-HDL, which is, again, better than LDL cholesterol. Point being is when you measure your ApoB or non-HDL, there's reference ranges. So go and get your test done.
Okay.
If you're high on those, then you might want to go back to your diet and understanding that the biggest lever that you can pull to reduce those is to swap calories from saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats, which in food form means less meats, less butter in particular, and less dairy fat if you're having a lot of it, and then more fatty fish if you eat seafood, or nuts, seeds, avocado, tofu, these kind of foods. That's what that would look like.
So why is it so important to reduce it?
So this comes back to the liver, and I said it's like the master regulator of metabolic health. One of the important functions of the liver is it has these receptors on it, these LDL receptors, and these receptors take up the ApoB particles, right? So that you can imagine that the issue with these ApoB containing lipoproteins in circulation is when they become too elevated, you get more of them crashing into the artery wall and getting retained. Mm-hmm. It's part of normal physiology to have these. You know, I mentioned it's taking fats out to cells, so it's not a case of trying to get it to zero. But different fats have different effect on the LDL receptor. Saturated fats decrease the sensitivity of that receptor. So if you imagine that receptor is like a bit like a gate, okay, and it's allowing these ApoBs back into the liver out of circulation. So it helps lower the level of ApoB in circulation. That's one of the liver's jobs. When you eat a lot of saturated fat, you start to close that gate. They can't get back into the liver. So what happens? They're building up. Imagine you're back to the analogy of the cargo ship. Imagine you're looking at a port and the guys on the cranes have gone on strike. They're not clearing the containers. You have all of these cargo ships building up in that port, right? And now these cargo ships have they're hanging around for longer. They can throw their anchor down and build up and get stuck. So saturated fats are reducing the LDL receptor sensitivity. Polyunsaturated fats do the exact opposite. So polyunsaturated fats open the gate up. They help the liver clear these ApoB containing lipoproteins. So that's the biggest lever that someone can pull, and that's very clear. There's metabolic ward clinical studies where they lock people up and feed them saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats and measure all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a meta-analysis of 395 experiments, Clark, and I can put that into the show notes, that tested this exactly. So again, you can't really change or intentionally change something if you don't measure it. Mm-hmm. And so back to your question about like how does someone know, and is there a difference between these different types of diets? It really comes back to the type of saturated fats they're eating, what foods are they in, and also their genetics. So that ability for saturated fat to shut the gate and polyunsaturated fats to open it is also modulated by our genes. Mm-hmm. So for example, I might be able to get away with a little bit more saturated fat than you. Mm-hmm. And that could be a genetic thing, right? So,
but it's not going to be such drastic differences.
It's not going to be drastic, huge differences. But it is important to acknowledge that, when we look at studies, you get the typical response, the average response. None of us are exactly representative of average. So you have to take the information and then, the broad theme, and then individualize it and personalize it based on your lab results, based on how you're feeling. And this is one of those examples where you look at an important risk factor, and then you can make a decision if you want to try and change certain aspects of your diet.
So the lab results part is really interesting to me, because I want to back up, and I think a lot of people might be thinking, okay, but how do I know that what you're saying is true? Because this other guy over here tells me that saturated fat is actually really good for me and it doesn't cause our biggest killers. How do I know what is true? And PUFAs are like the worst thing ever. How do you back up and help people to see that what you're saying is because of the evidence, the body of evidence?
We have very strong data on saturated fats and hard health outcomes, which means looking at clinical trials, comparing groups that are either randomized, so these are randomized controlled trials, compare people that are randomized to saturated fat intervention or polyunsaturated fat intervention. And there's now so many of those clinical trials that you can do a meta-analysis. So Cochrane review, which is considered one of the highest quality meta-analyses that can exist, or group that does them, they did a 2020 meta-analysis of this and looked at exactly that. All those trials put together, what do we see? You see a 21% reduction in coronary heart disease when you swap calories from saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. That's very hard to argue with, right? Those are hard health outcome studies, right? We're looking at people over time who are either eating saturated fat or polyunsaturated fats, and how many of them are having a heart attack. Now, we can take that a step further, because it's not just that we understand that saturated fat is people that eat more saturated fat have more heart disease. We actually understand the primary mechanism by which that occurs. And it comes back to what I just mentioned before, that saturated fat is reducing your liver's ability to clear these ApoB containing lipoproteins that are mostly LDLs, and they build up. And we have a huge body of evidence showing that LDL cholesterol is causal, right? Directly causes atherosclerosis. So that buildup of that fatty plaque is caused by an elevation in LDL cholesterol, more specifically these ApoB containing lipoproteins. So you might say, well, what's that evidence? Okay, well, we have observational studies, which are the weakest form of evidence I'm going to point to. Tens and tens. We have millions of person-year follow-up looking at people over time. How much saturated fat are they eating? What's their risk of heart disease? And we see very clearly across the world, cohorts all across the world, different cultures, people who eat more saturated fat have a higher risk of have elevated LDL cholesterol and have a higher risk of coronary heart disease. And it's linear. The more the LDL cholesterol goes up, the higher their risk of heart disease. So that's like evidence one. Evidence two, we have these Mendelian studies, which is a fancy word essentially for genetic studies. So you can be born with certain gene mutations that either lower your LDL cholesterol or increase it. And these are incredible studies, because if you think about it, it's kind of like nature's randomized controlled trial. You have mommy and daddy really have no say. You just pop out and you've been randomized to having super low LDL cholesterol or super high. What do we see? Well, and this is really interesting, because these are people that are exposed to that level of cholesterol over a lifetime. And we know that that's super important, lifetime exposure. Same as cigarettes. Like pack years, it's now being called cholesterol years. So there's so much evidence showing that people who are born with a genetic mutation that results in super elevated LDL cholesterol, these people can have a cardiac event when they're teenagers. Many of them die in their 20s if they're untreated.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we see the exact opposite, that people who have super low LDL cholesterol, incredibly low risk of heart disease. If they're like won the genetic lottery and their LDL cholesterol is just crazy low, down at physiologic levels like 30 milligrams per deciliter, these people are not getting heart disease. Okay, so that's number two. And then number three is randomized controlled trials. So you take people later in life, once they have cardiovascular disease, usually you give them a drug that lowers their LDL cholesterol and you look at hard endpoints. What happens? Do they have less heart attacks? Are they less likely to die? And you see the same thing again. Now, in those studies, people often point to the fact that the risk reduction is not huge. And I like to remind people that you can only do so much. When you're 65 and you start to intervene after decades and decades and decades of pounding saturated fat and having all this damage and plaque accumulation in the artery, you can't expect to have the same risk reduction that you would have if you won the genetic lottery and had low cholesterol from birth, right? So that's why we see different risk reductions between the genetic studies and the clinical trials. But we have that observational data, we have genetic studies, and we have randomized controlled trials, all telling us the same thing, that when you get LDL cholesterol down, people have less events, heart attacks and strokes. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence. It's certainly not something that, I would want to ignore. I've got cardiovascular disease in my family. I watched my dad have a heart attack at 41. So I take this stuff pretty seriously. I want to get to 50, 60, 70 and hopefully be in good health and, not rushed off to hospital having some sort of cardiac event.
Totally. I mean, that's really compelling evidence. So for anybody who maybe is skeptical of research and science and wants to look back more at the appeal to nature type of look, how do you respond to that because you sort of touch on it, but can you go into a little bit further about why we don't want to just look at the appeal to nature, that, well, our ancestors ate that way? What's the disconnect there? Well,
I think we just have to, it just comes back to realizing what the goal of our ancestors was and what evolution is. It's to get you to an age to procreate. Evolution does not care if you have a heart attack at 60. Evolution does not care if you have a heart attack at 70. It doesn't care if you get cancer at 60 or 70, right? So if you're interested in good health later in life, we have to look beyond speculation of what our ancestors may or may not have eaten. Yeah. And back to what I said earlier, I don't even think we can put our finger on this is the ancestral diet. You can get some general themes, but there's no way of doing that. So, I think you can look at that and be interested in it. But if your goal is to increase the number of years that you live in good health, which is essentially increasing your health span, you're trying to shrink the number of years where you're affected by disease, then you have to look to the science that is studying people over time and looking at biomarkers that predict longevity, right? Because we have different goals to our ancestors.
Yes.
We're not just here to survive. We have so many food options available to us that our ancestors didn't. And so we're in this privileged position of saying, okay, we don't have to just go out and eat calories to survive and eat whatever we can get our hands on. We can actually look at the science that we have and make a more calculated decision and increase our chance of getting to 60, 65 without developing cancer, without having a heart attack, without having a stroke. And so
hopefully to our 80s and 90s.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing to consider here is the types of foods that our ancestors were eating and whether they are the same as the types of foods that people who are adopting different variations of these ancestral diets are eating today, specifically meat. So there's a really interesting paper by Lauren Cordain, who is kind of like the father or one of the fathers of the paleo diet. And he wanted to look at what are the typical cholesterol levels in hunter-gatherer tribes. And anyone can go out and look at this, and there's a beautiful graph in there. And with the data that's available to us looking at different hunter-gatherer tribes, we know that their cholesterol levels are not high. Now, you might think, well, how can that be if they're eating a lot of animal foods that are rich in saturated fats? What's happening here? Well, there's good kind of archaeological evidence that suggests the types of meats that our ancestors were eating were probably a lot leaner than the types of meats today. So leaner than beef and lamb. Our ancestors would have been eating woolly mammoth and antelope and venison type of meat. So that's the other thing to kind of consider here when we're thinking about eating like our ancestors. Are we truly eating like them, or are we kind of just eating the foods that we want to eat today and making ourselves feel good by telling ourselves that that's the same foods that they ate a long time ago. So that's the kind of, that's the way that I think about that.
I think a lot of people who might be listening, maybe your audience, but definitely my audience, might be younger. And so they might not be thinking that far down the road. And so it's easy to just go to this, oh yeah, this makes sense. This, nature, this is how our ancestors ate, not realizing that there are certain foods that definitely prevent our biggest killers. So when you take that evidence into consideration, it kind of goes against that personal bias that you would have. But can you go into PUFAs then? Because this is kind of their big pushback on that explanation about saturated fat as well. Look at the charts. They have charts showing like the increase in PUFA consumption shows an increase in these types of diseases. How do you respond to that?
Firstly, that's some of the most weakest data that you can present. That's called ecological. So
why is it weak?
What I find is interesting because it's unadjusted. So you can basically just go out and look at two different trends and show an association, right? If you go out and say in the last 100 years, PUFAs have increased and obesity's increased, therefore PUFAs must be causing obesity. There's so many other things that have also changed during that period. People are more sedentary. People are eating 60% of their calories from ultra processed foods. Now they may contain PUFAs, but that doesn't mean that PUFAs are inherently a problem.
It doesn't mean that's the PUFA
that's a food
in
matrix.
The ultra processed food. Yeah,
right. There's so many different things in there.
Yeah,
and they're hyperpalatable. They're low protein. They're low water. They're low fiber. All of these different myriad of characteristics that can lead to overconsumption. I kind of look at that ecological association, and mind you, what is left out there often is that PUFAs have gone up since 1960. Cardiovascular disease mortality has halved since 1960. They're inverse. So I could sit here and create the same argument and say, we've increased PUFAs dramatically since 1960 and less people are dying of cardiovascular disease. I think it's a pretty weak argument. I wouldn't really make it. But that's the kind of same kind of logic.
So for anyone too saying like, what is a PUFA?
PUFA is a polyunsaturated fat. So there's essentially high level. There's four different types of fats: saturated fats, trans fats, monounsaturated fats with that double bond, polyunsaturated fats with two or more. The foods that are richest in polyunsaturated fats are fatty fish, your walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, these types of foods. And then monounsaturated fats are rich in like avocados and olive oil. And saturated fats tend to be richest in animal foods, but not exclusively. So there are some plant foods like coconut oil and palm oil, which are the two tropical oils that are rich in saturated fat. The claims around polyunsaturated fats that I've seen are that people say they increase inflammation, and people say that they're obesogenic, they increase body weight, and that they increase risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, we've just spoken to the clinical studies that contradict the cardiovascular disease point. I think the most compelling evidence that we have that we can look at here for just polyunsaturated fats in general, and if people need to be worried about them, do we need to fear them? Right. I'm not paid by big polyunsaturated fat.
Yeah.
I could quite easily have low polyunsaturated fats and eat monounsaturated fats. But the evidence suggests if you're limiting polyunsaturated fats in your diet, you're leaving health on the table.
Which is so contradictory to this world of eating and what they advocate for. It's like PUFAs are the worst, especially specifically seed oils.
Right.
Like
but a lot of that's
oil.
Also the naturalistic fallacy. It's how they're produced. They'll show videos of the production and say, look, this can't be healthy. And, I think that's interesting. But I think, again, you have to go and look at the evidence that we have. And we have really solid evidence that shows, and it's not just observational evidence where you do a dietary assessment and then look at outcomes. The neat thing with polyunsaturated fats is that they're essential. Our body doesn't make them. So when you measure them in circulation or in tissues, what does that mean? That means they must have come in through your diet.
Like as opposed to saturated fats.
Right. So you can...
That our body makes. For anyone who doesn't know that our body makes.
Yeah, so our body can make saturated fats. There are studies, large population studies, where they not only do a dietary assessment, they actually measure, they do either serum, so looking at circulation, or adipose tissue, looking at the actual levels of linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, so it's a type of polyunsaturated fat. It is the polyunsaturated fat that is most rich in seed oils, right? So in these studies with tens and tens of thousands of people, They go and measure how much linoleic acid, omega-6, is in their fat tissue and is in circulation. And then they look at, okay, based on the variance in these levels, is there a difference in health outcomes? Do the people that have more linoleic acid in their fat stored in their body, do they have an increase in certain diseases? Mm-hmm. Are they living longer? Are they living shorter? What do you see? You see people that have more linoleic acid, these polyunsaturated fats, in their tissues, in their body, okay? They have lower risk of cardiovascular disease. They have lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, and they have lower risk of total mortality, which means death from all causes. These people with more linoleic acid, and I'll link to this study because if anyone is of the view that polyunsaturated fats are harmful, you have to read this paper. There's multiple papers. I'll give you a couple of them. People that have more linoleic acid in their tissue have lower total mortality. They're living longer. So wow. I look at that data and I find it very hard to take the position that polyunsaturated fats are harmful and that we need to avoid them.
What about the difference, though, between like a whole walnut versus canola oil, right? Are many of the studies understanding the difference there? Are they looking at the difference?
There are some studies that have attempted to look at the difference between oils and whole foods like olive oil and nuts. And, generally, my view, I think the whole food is probably better. And I say that mostly because you're getting slightly better nutrition, but also from a satiety point of view. Oils are very calorie dense. So if someone's goal is to lose weight, lowering the calorie density of the diet is a good thing. But at the same time, I wouldn't generate fear over oils at all. If someone's cooking with those oils in their diet and it's a healthy body weight and they're not gaining weight, then it's a way better option than butter.
Than cooking it with butter.
Right.
That's super interesting.
Which is now, ironically, is being marketed as a superfood again.
Yeah, butter is a superfood now, guys. It's back and forth. You just never know what it is. But you feel like the science is pretty clear that it's one.
And it's not really back or forth. Like if we go back to where I kind of begun with saturated fat, the reason that you'll see different views out there is people are not considering the context. What is the dose of saturated fat? What type of saturated fat? What's it being compared to? And who are the people in the study? And if you don't consider that context, you can get easily confused on this topic. Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to processed food, ultra-processed foods, then oil is a component. Those processed oils like canola oil and different seed oils, they are a component of the ultra-processed food. So what is it that makes ultra-processed foods unhealthy? Is it just the fact that they're calorie dense and low in nutrients, or is it more than that? Could it be that it's the fact that it's isolated foods like processed sugar and oils and lack of fiber and low in nutrients, all of that?
It's an answer that is still up for debate, right? People are still looking at it. But I mean, if you think about it just generally, we know that they're hyperpalatable and they lead to excessive calorie consumption. And we know that energy toxicity is really damaging. I think that it's a twofold kind of problem here. One is that these foods they're low fiber, they're low water, they're usually low protein, they're calorie dense. All of these things leads to overconsumption, right? They're not great from a satiety point of view, filling you up on fewer calories.
Yeah. And less nutrients.
The other thing is, what's the opportunity cost? When you're eating these foods, what are you not eating? Mm-hmm. Other foods that have inherent benefits that come with a lot of nutrition, fruits and vegetables and legumes, these types of foods are being pushed out of the diet. So I think you see the net effect on health is a summation of those two things.
Yes. I think that's a missing component people are often thinking about. Like if I'm eating this ultra processed food every single day, for every snack, every day or every lunch, then you're missing the opportunity to eat whole plant foods with lots of vegetables and fresh fruits and nutrient dense calories. I think we can get into now specifics on some of the claims of these trends. And I think maybe we should first round out the topic of butter. It's becoming very popular now that, we're getting back to the way that our great-grandparents lived on a farm and they milk their own cow and then we make our own butter and it's so healthy for us. Why is it not so healthy for us? Other than what you already explained.
The big two reasons are ApoB, so it's going to increase ApoB. We've got to remember, heart disease is the number one cause of death globally. It's the most likely reason that any of the listeners are going to die, right? So you should take that pretty seriously.
Yeah.
If there's a biomarker you're going to be most interested in, it's ApoB. I also mentioned that saturated fat. So butter is very rich in saturated fats, and particularly the saturated fats that increase hepatic fat. So increase that fat that's building up in the liver, it's building up in the pancreas. It leads to insulin resistance. So from a metabolic health, it's going to be damaging there compared to eating foods that are rich in unsaturated fats, whether that's monounsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats. So, I think that the reason that this is trendy is because people see it as kind of natural, ancestral, but they're not appreciating that they can feel good today and still be increasing their risk of disease in decades to come because these things bubble away under the surface. Right?
That is such an important point, because people might say, well, I feel good eating this way. I'm eating these whole foods from animal products as a basis of my diet and I feel good. So how could I possibly be, promoting the disease of the majority of what Americans are eating, because they see that the majority of Americans are eating lots of ultra-processed foods. So they think, well, I'm doing it differently. I'm eating whole foods. It's just like largely from animal sources, but they think that's very different than what the standard American is eating that are also dying of. So,
and it is better, and it makes sense that they feel good relative to a standard American diet eating that way.
Absolutely.
It's just not necessarily representative of how they're going to feel in 20, 30, 40 years. So it comes back to, what are you valuing and what are your goals here, right? If you're just thinking about the here and now and how you feel today, and you're not so concerned about 20, 30, 40 years down the track, then maybe that doesn't matter.
I mean, I do think people do care about that, but they're thinking that it's not going to cause that because they are so convinced that it's actually like the PUFAs that are causing.
The science is very clear that there is a theme that is consistent with good long-term health. And that is a diet that is low in saturated fats. It's rich in polyunsaturated fats. It's low in ultra-processed foods. This is not debated in nutrition in the academic science world. It's only debated online. It is absolutely the consensus position with regards to how do we get people to feel really good today and feel better long-term. And I can empathize with someone who adopts, quote unquote, ancestral kind of diet and feels better today. I would just urge them to consider some food swaps. And look, some people feel better on a low carbohydrate diet. Some people lose more weight on a low carbohydrate diet. Some people lose more weight on a high carb diet. We know that's very clear in the trials. Multiple ways to do it. Why that is the case, not so sure yet. Hasn't been elucidated. Is it genetics? Is it something to do with the food reward systems and differences between people? Unsure. But what I would urge someone who's adopted that style of eating is to, within that framework, what are the changes you can make that are going to shift some of these very potent risk factors in the right direction, right? How are we going to get your visceral fat down, that fat out of your liver and out of your pancreas? How are we going to get ApoB down? And can you do that in a way where you still feel happy and you enjoy your diet? That's kind of, the position that I would take with that.
Do you think listing out the different types of diets that are trendy right now that maybe are super high in saturated fat or very high in saturated fat, but they have different variations, different kinds of sets of guidelines, do you think they are very different from each other or pretty similar from each other?
Some of them are kind of more of a step in the right direction, I think, than others. If you go fully to the far, far left, you're at a carnivore or all meat diet with no fiber. And the data on fiber is really clear. There's a dose-dependent relationship. The more fiber you have, the lower risk of colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes, various forms of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and people are living longer. And that actually doesn't seem to tap out at 30, 35 grams a day, which is what the recommendations are. Average person's only getting about 15.
Wow.
It seems to go beyond that. Right. And there's just not enough people in these studies consuming 50 grams plus to get a sort of fully appreciate that. But certainly, so if we were kind of looking at different ancestral diets, I think the ones that lean in more to different types of fruits and some vegetables, and so they're consuming more fiber, I think those are a healthier variation of those types of diets. And I bet if it was to be studied and you compared all these different types, the people that are eating in that way with a more of a high fiber approach, they would have healthier, their risk factors would look better than the people who are just going completely carnivore, very high saturated fat and no or very low fiber.
What about the difference between a dietary pattern that excludes dairy and does a lot of different kinds of meat, like maybe chicken and turkey, and fruits and vegetables, versus a diet that is rich in red meat and butter and cheese and whole milk and also fruits and vegetables? How do you compare those two?
I think if you were going to include animal foods in your diet and you wanted to do it in the most healthful manner, it's the Mediterranean diet. It's a diet that has more of an emphasis on fatty fish. It has a low emphasis on red and white meat. I don't think that white meat is particularly there's not much signal to suggest it's much better than red meat. Both of them seem to be just as kind of problematic as one another. That doesn't mean that you can't have any red or white meat in your diet. This is another area where people get very confused. The dose of a lot of these things is the poison. And so even if you look at the red meat literature and you look at unprocessed red meat, I think this is super interesting. And this is something that many in the vegan community are not appreciating or communicating. And I think that's a bias there.
Yeah, totally.
Right. But as I said at the start, I think you should just put the information out as it is. And if you want to argue about the planet or animal welfare, that's separate. So when you look at the red meat literature that we have, there's really conflicting results. So some studies suggest that red meat is not increasing risk of cardiovascular disease or colorectal cancer. They're like the big two that come up with unprocessed red meat, whereas other studies suggest it is. So why the difference? Has science confused here again? Dig into the studies, look at the context. So what you see is very consistently in North America, when you compare high and low unprocessed red meat intake, you see an increase in risk of cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer. When you look at Asian cohorts and you compare high and low, you tend not to see that. Here's the really important thing. When you're comparing high and low, those are just relative things. It really depends what is high and what is low.
What is low?
And in Asia, they're not consuming much unprocessed red meat. So when you're comparing high and low, they're both actually low and they're very close together. So of course you don't see a difference.
Interesting.
When you look at the American cohorts, and now you get this beautiful contrast because you get some people that have 150 grams of red meat a day, unprocessed, some people that have very little. Now you can see signal. You see increased risk of colorectal cancer, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So instead of like looking at, just part of that evidence and choosing the one that suits you, let's look at all of it and realize that probably what we're seeing here is that the dose matters a lot. And so when you're getting up over 100 grams of unprocessed red meat a day, it seems pretty consistent that you're increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease and colorectal cancer. So if I was to eat a diet that contained animal foods, and I certainly think you can adopt a healthy diet that does contain animal foods, it would be a very plant-rich Mediterranean diet that's featuring more fatty fish and legumes and some whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and olive oil. And then it de-emphasizes the kind of inclusion of both white and red meat.
Interesting. And then what about the dairy component? Because these two types of diet options I was explaining, I think would be more like a paleo that's excluding dairy versus like a Western price nourishing traditions type diet that eats a lot of dairy.
The evidence on dairy is pretty interesting as well. So I think, firstly, it depends on what you're comparing it to. I think dairy can be part of a healthy dietary pattern, but it probably comes down to what type of dairy are we talking about and, how much is someone consuming.
So can we get some concrete, like what does how much, those different rates of too much, not as much?
Probably 1 or 2 serves a day of yogurt and cheese. Yogurt and cheese, like the fermented dairy, seem to be the ones that are either neutral or perhaps even in some circumstances beneficial. They're providing calcium and protein. And so if you were to replace them, I think you can have a dairy-free diet and be just as healthy, but the replacement's really important. You're replacing with foods that are rich in calcium, rich in protein, and have fermented foods in your diet. So
that's why what you're replacing it is so important. When you said it can be beneficial, is like, okay, if you're taking out red meat and butter and swapping it for yogurt, that is beneficial.
Correct. But if you take out these dairy foods and instead eat ultra processed foods, that's probably a move in the wrong direction, right? Yeah. So it depends what you replace it with. If you replace it with a soy yogurt, for example, or soy milk, you're moving in a step in the right direction. So that's important. And then just realizing that the saturated fats in dairy do have a different effect on our body than the saturated fats in red meat. And the reason why butter is so problematic is that butter is a heavily refined food, massively refined. And so to make butter, you actually have to essentially you change the structure of the food matrix. And in cheese, in yogurt, in less processed forms of dairy, the saturated fats are suspended in what's called a milk fat globule. And that milk fat globule reduces the effect that saturated fats have on our ApoB cholesterol and our cholesterol. In butter, you break that milk fat globule down. So now these saturated fats are all of a sudden much more potent.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some other specific claims like bone broth. That's a really big one right now. That bone broth is super nourishing, very good for you. It enhances your health in all different kinds of ways. What does the evidence say about that?
I think they think that bone broth contains certain minerals and amino acids and collagen. And so therefore they assume that this is good for gut health and skin and hair and stuff like that. But I think strong claims do require strong evidence. And there's literally there's like no evidence looking at how bone broth affects human health. There's one safety study, which I think is important because these bone broth and gelatin, these can be highly concentrated in heavy metals like lead, cadmium. So there was one study that looked into that because people were concerned. And that study seemed to suggest that at least in that sample, that the levels were actually probably safe for humans, which is good, but it could be highly variable depending on where you're sourcing this from. But in terms of like the benefits of it, there's just no clinical data. So it's all anecdotal. And without having a control in place, you have no idea. Like you need to have a control in place to understand like how much of the benefit is driven by placebo, how much of it is driven by the actual constituents in this food and how it interacts with your physiology. The studies that do exist are looking at kind of mice, and it's very hard to extrapolate from those papers.
Yeah, totally. And what about real vitamin A? That's something that you hear a lot, that you shouldn't be eating, you shouldn't be getting your vitamin A from plants because of the conversion, and you need real vitamin A retinol.
So our body will convert beta carotene to vitamin A. And unless you have a specific gene mutation that is really downshifting that conversion, your body will convert enough. And we know that. And I can link to one study, there's many, but a study out of Switzerland that was looking at omnivores, vegetarians, and vegans. The vegans were eating a very high quality diet. We know that because they were consuming about 35 to 40 grams of fiber a day. Really important when you're looking at these studies to kind of work out, is this like a junk food vegan diet or is it a healthy one? Yeah. This seemed to be representative of a healthy diet, and these were kind of middle-aged adults. And they assessed their actual vitamin A levels, serum vitamin A levels, and they were completely fine in the vegan group across the board, no issues at all. So is there genetic anomalies, and is there going to be individuals out there who maybe are not as good at converting beta carotene? Yeah, for sure. So, back to what I said earlier, we know the general characteristics of healthy diets. We know what works for the typical person, for most people, but there is some level of individualization that you need to explore here, right? Which is, my approach is understand the theme and then explore the individualization within that theme and, kind of fine tune and optimize things from there.
Okay. Okay, now I want to talk about anti-nutrients. That's a big one too now. Of the, you shouldn't be eating the foods with anti-nutrients. Where is that claim coming from, and what are your thoughts on it?
So we probably have to step through 2 or 3 of these.
Okay.
Lectins come up, phytates come up, and oxalates.
Okay.
They're probably the big 3. There's also tannins and saponins and goitrogens. Right. We could spend all day discussing this.
Yeah. But those 3.
The big 3. So lectins, what are lectins? I think, firstly, back to what I said earlier about people having very strong opinions about lectins. I think a lot of people say that and are not even fully familiar with what a lectin is.
Yeah, totally.
So a lectin is a protein.
Okay.
There's over 500 different types of lectins found in plant foods. And the claim is that lectins negatively affect the gut lining. That leads to separation of what's called the tight junctions. And it creates these gaps that allows compounds to flow from the intestine into the bloodstream that ordinarily wouldn't, and they provoke an inflammatory response. That separation of the tight junctions in science is called increased intestinal permeability. In lay sort of language is called leaky gut. Right? So lectins, leaky gut, inflammation, that's the narrative that's out there. Right? So therefore, we should be very scared of the most lectin-containing foods, which is legumes and whole grains. So we kind of need to step through this. Let's start zooming in on the claims and the evidence that someone might put forward that is in support of this. And this came mostly from Stephen Gundry, who wrote Plant Paradox a few years back. He sort of put this on the map, and then people have run with it. And he sells a supplement called Lectin Shield. So he created the problem and he sells you the solution. But I was incredibly interested I read his book and I wanted to know, what is the evidence that he's putting forward here? And so firstly, he cites studies looking at animal studies where they take isolated lectins. So this is not people or animals being fed a whole food, literally extract the lectin out, give a very high dose to an animal and see what happens. See if you can increase inflammation. And there are some studies that show that. But we have to understand that one compound from a food that we isolate out in an animal study, I mean, how can we generalize that to a human?
That would never happen in real life.
That isolated compound could behave and very likely does very differently when it's in a whole food form matrix and when it's being consumed by humans in a dose that they would be exposed to in their diet ordinarily. So that's the first thing, that predominantly what he's doing is citing animal studies. Secondly, he does cite some human studies. And so there are studies showing people that consumed legumes, there was varying degrees of toxicity. All of these studies, and it's very clear in them, they're case studies were when humans were consuming improperly prepared legumes. What does that mean? So that's not soaking and boiling, which you would do if you were buying sort of dried beans. Yeah. When you're buying canned beans, that's already done for you. Okay. And
so how are you eating legumes if you're not boiling it?
Well, you can boil it and not boil it for long enough. And so the way to know this is if you bite into a legume, and I don't recommend eating them if they're like this, is if they're still a little bit hard and crunchy, they should be very soft. Yes. You should put it between your molars and they just squish down, like the enchiladas we had last night.
Yeah, they were very good.
And the reason for that is that when you soak and cook these foods properly, 93 to 96% of the lectins are destroyed.
Oh my gosh.
And there is study after study showing that.
So the human studies, like they just didn't cook them properly.
They just didn't cook them properly. And it's actually noted in the studies. Like these were people who had toxicity.
That's ridiculous.
So, and then the other thing that Gundry cites, and he makes a big deal of it, he says that there's peer-reviewed evidence that lectins are inflammatory and damaging to human health. And if you actually look up that citation, it's an abstract that he wrote in a journal, sure, but it's just an abstract summarizing a poster that he had at a conference, which is just explaining anecdotal case studies that he saw as a doctor. That's not a clinical trial. That's not people who were randomized to a diet that was low lectin and a high lectin diet and looked at outcomes. Right? There could be many reasons why his results were what they were. They're going to be affected by all sorts of biases, terribly weak data. And then, so we could almost just stop there, but let's just zoom out and think about this a little bit more. Let's look at the people that are eating the most legumes. What's their health like long term? And we actually see a dose-dependent response again here. We see that as people increase their legume consumption up to about 400 grams a week, and then it plateaus. Up to 400 grams a week, they're reducing their risk of all sorts of chronic diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, events, and mortality. And that's, I guess, 2 or 3 cups. Every sort of piece of information that we have about the lectin story suggests that it's not something to fear if you're properly preparing your foods. I don't recommend slow cooking legumes. Slow cooking legumes is usually done at a lower temperature.
Okay.
And when you slow cook legumes and it's below 100 degrees, you actually can get an increase in lectins. So that's something for people to be mindful of. And just being mindful of when you're eating whole grains and you're eating lectins, are they cooked? Do they taste cooked or do they taste crunchy and hard?
Yeah.
If they taste crunchy and hard, then you probably want to take them back to the pot and cook them properly.
I can't believe that about the study, that they just were testing against legumes in a way that people don't eat. You don't really want to eat legumes like that.
Yeah. And there's I put this on my phone, but there's a paper that I'll give you that people can read. It's called, Is There Such a Thing as Antinutrients? A Narrative Review of Perceived Problematic Plant Compounds by Petrosky et al. And so there's kind of like a really nice summary of some of those things that I just discussed.
And does that include like all the different antinutrients?
So phytates and oxalates. And oxalates is super interesting.
Okay, let's get into that one. That's one that Paul Saladino talks about, I think, right?
He talks about phytates too. So, oxalates, the main claim is that oxalates bind calcium and they increase risk of calcium oxalate kidney stones. First thing for people to understand here is that more than 50% of oxalates that are in your circulation are not from your diet. Your body makes them. Okay, so that's a really important point because often people are sort of suggesting that any food that contains oxalates should steer clear of, but they're completely unaware of the physiology that our body actually makes oxalates, and we have a system in place to get rid of them. They get filtered out by the kidney and excreted through the urine. So that's the first thing to realize. The second thing is there are studies looking at different dietary patterns and people with calcium oxalate kidney stones. What are the best dietary patterns for these people? Yeah. And it's quite clear, and there's no studies looking at a plant-exclusive vegan diet, but there is studies looking at a vegetarian diet. And the vegetarian diet is associated with the lowest risk of these calcium oxalate kidney stones, possible? Even though it's high in oxalates. Here's what it comes down to. High dietary oxalates is only going to be a problem for someone who's consuming insufficient amounts of calcium. And this is why anyone who if someone's listening who has a history of calcium oxalate kidney stones, one of the first things they'll be told by their physician is make sure you're getting enough calcium in your diet. Because when you're consuming a diet that's high in oxalates but has low calcium, much more of that oxalate will be absorbed. But when you're consuming a diet that's rich in calcium and has high oxalates, the calcium is binding to the oxalates and they get excreted through the body. They're not even absorbed into circulation. So if someone's eating a plant-based diet and they're getting enough calcium, there's no issue here. The only time someone would really ever run into a problem with oxalates in a plant-based diet is if for some reason they had no diversity and they chose to get all of their calcium from really high oxalate foods like spinach and rhubarb greens. Okay. But if you're eating with diversity and you've got these low oxalate greens like kale and rocket or arugula, or whatever you call it, in your diet, then you have nothing to worry about there. The other interesting thing here is that the endogenous production of oxalates is really interesting because when you consume more animal protein, and it's not fully understood how this occurs, but it's thought to be the type of amino acids, particularly amino acids like hydroxyproline. You actually increase the amount of oxalates your body produces. High animal protein diets are very strongly associated with calcium oxalate kidney stones, as is high sodium. So generally the recommendations for someone, if they want to avoid a calcium oxalate kidney stone, or they have them and they don't want to get another one or exacerbate it, is to make sure you have enough calcium in your diet, to make sure you have enough potassium, which is fruits and vegetables. And we know very clearly people who consume more fruits and vegetables have less kidney stones.
And what's the calcium recommendations you have?
You want to get at least north of 700-800 milligrams a day.
From what sources?
So you can go dark leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables. You've got your white beans have calcium in them. A lot of the kind of soy milk or plant-based milks now will have them. You can get some tofu, calcium set tofu, sesame seeds, all of those sorts of things are going to be where you get it from. And you want to try and target 700 to 800 milligrams or north of that per day. And if someone wanted to track that, they can use an app like Chronometer and just put a day of eating in and kind of see where they land. But enough calcium, enough potassium, de-emphasizing animal protein, and de-emphasizing sodium. Sodium's another one that really drives up the risk of these kidney stones. These are more things for people to focus on if they have a family history of a calcium oxalate kidney stone, or if they've had one themselves.
So I want to talk about Paul Saladino. We talked about the oxalate, and I want to get into the phytate too, but you worked out with him recently. How did that go?
It was fun. Like he's a nice, charismatic dude, and we had a good chat, and we disagree on a lot of things, but we also agree on quite a number of things. So I had a good time, and hopefully in the future at some point we can kind of sit down and flesh things out. But we worked out for 2 or 3 hours. We literally trained everything that we could, every body part, and just chatted about science and our different views. And it was a very interesting, but it was like a friendly conversation. I enjoyed it. I disagree a lot with Paul, but I also appreciate that he's changed his views a few times on certain things. And he seems open to that. As have I. I've changed my view on certain things over the years. So I think if I was going to have a discussion with someone that comes at this from a different angle, then he would be a good person to do that with.
Yes, I would love to do that conversation. Just maybe one day we'll put it out there with Paul Saladino, and you guys would make an amazing match. So something else he talks about a lot is phytates. And what do you? He
says phytates will rob you of minerals.
Yeah,
that's the main claim.
Where is he in that claim?
So there is some truth that phytates can bind minerals, particularly iron and zinc. Again, phytates are largely destroyed when you soak food. So phytates are kind of found mostly in whole grains, in some in legumes and nuts and seeds. And Paul will point to a single study where there was a single meal, right, looking at a high phytate kind of meal and what happened to the absorption of certain minerals. And that's interesting. But we have more evidence showing that the body is very adaptive. So as you habitually consume a high phytate diet, the body responds. So in that single meal, you might see reduced mineral absorption. But there's a great study looking at postmenopausal women and iron absorption with high phytate diets. And when you get them consuming it habitually for weeks, what happens? The body ramps up iron absorption. It adjusts. So this is another example of just like looking at the study in context, understanding what other evidence is out there, and then
and why it might be doing that. Maybe the person's not used to eating those foods. So when you start on that, it's going to have a different kind of response when you don't normally eat that food.
Yeah. And so there, certainly, I think, again, properly preparing your foods is important. It will increase the mineral availability in your food, particularly iron and zinc. And if someone has low iron, then they might want to think about this even more. So what are some of the things that you can do if you're consuming plant foods that contain phytates other than just preparing them properly to increase iron absorption and zinc absorption? There's a few different things. One is increase the sources of vitamin C in your diet. So squeezing lime or lemon juice on a salad, or eating bell peppers, capsicum, we call them in Australia, with food. They're really rich in vitamin C. Things of that nature will increase absorption of iron. Cooking with garlic and onion, both of these alliums increase iron absorption. So if you're whatever kind of stir fry or whatever dinner you're preparing, if you can work garlic and onion in, they will significantly increase the absorption of iron and zinc. And then the other one is fermented foods. So fermented foods also will increase the bioavailability of iron and zinc and other minerals that are in your food. So if, that's probably too much for someone to focus on if their iron levels are fine.
Yeah.
But if you're noticing that your iron levels are low, then you might want to kind of look into that.
Yeah. I think all this stuff is super interesting about the phytates and the oxalates. And then even as far as like the saturated fat and unsaturated fat, I feel like sometimes it feels like it's missing the component of just a holistic perspective. Like I'm actually even surprised that Paul would be looking at it in that way, like one specific mechanism in a food. And I know that's like science, but I feel like if you just take a step back, it just reminds me of the book Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition by T. Colin Campbell, the nutritional biochemist. I loved that book. That was one of my favorite nutrition books. What do you think about that? About his complaint about looking at science in the wrong way, like focusing on one specific nutrient in a food or something, a component of within
But I
a
think
food.
that the scientists and researchers are aware of that. Right. So like, for example, in this case, you have the single meal study where they look at one food that's high in phytate and look at mineral absorption. But there are studies looking at mixed meals. And the reason mixed meals is important is that, you have things like vitamin C and garlic and onion in a mixed meal, which is more representative of how someone would eat in real life.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not that the researchers are unaware of this. The problem is when you're trying to build a case on social media and you just go and select one piece of that evidence.
Yeah, totally.
I think in this case, when you look at the overall evidence, it's quite clear that, phytates aren't something that people need to be scared of. If anything, and this is an emerging area of science, phytates have anti-cancer properties. So they're being looked at very heavily for treatment during cancer.
Wow.
And they seem to, there's a few different mechanisms, but they seem to reduce free radicals and oxidative stress, damage to cells. So I think that's worth noting as well, is these are often painted as harmful, bad compounds, but they might also be beneficial at a certain dose too.
And certain type of thing. That's interesting. For people listening, Simon and I have been going back and forth about saturated fat and coconut because I tend to just naturally feel like coconut is obviously a health food. Just like living in Hawaii, it makes sense to me. But you have a problem with looking at food in that way and to looking at it with the scientific perspective. But I'm curious, maybe we can get into it just a tiny bit about, is it possible that the studies on saturated fat, or just in general, anything, PUFAs, all of it, are missing that maybe it's not just the saturated fat or just the polyunsaturated fat that's affecting the health outcome. It's the holistic part of the food. So is it possible that the saturated fat in coconut is going to respond differently in our bodies than the saturated fat in red meat?
It's not just possible. We know that. So it's not as though these studies haven't sort of separated out different foods and different types of saturated fat and looked at their unique effects on lipids. That has been done. And there are some subtle differences, though, when it comes to coconut. But when you look at, say, the effect of saturated fats found typically in a food like red meat or butter, and you compare those to the saturated fats in coconut oil, now they both raise LDL cholesterol, but the saturated fats in butter and in red meat on a gram per gram basis increase LDL cholesterol more than coconut oil in that case, right? Where the data is a little bit limited on coconut is a couple of places. One is that unlike the saturated fats that are in red meat, where we have hard health outcome data, we know that they actually increase events. Remember I spoke about those trials. With coconut oil, all we have is this data that shows that coconut oil raises LDL cholesterol. And as we went over before, we have reason to believe strongly that that means they're going to have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But we don't have the longer term trials with coconut products showing actual increases in events, right? So we are speculating a little bit more on coconut than we would say on a food like butter or red meat, which we know much more about. The other layer here is how important is the food matrix? So I'm hoping that the listeners, one thing that they take home is that the food matrix is really important and it affects how saturated fats affect your physiology. The example I gave before was that yogurt and cheese has a different effect on your blood lipids than butter, because the more refined it became, it affected the way that those saturated fats were absorbed and ultimately how they'd affect blood lipids. Now, it may well be a very similar thing with coconut. Coconut oil may have a different or significantly different effect on blood lipids than eating coconut flesh. So I'm sounding like a broken record here, but what I would say is if you're including coconut products in your diet, it's the same rule as before. You can't meaningfully change something or understand your risk if you're not measuring. So go and measure ApoB or non-HDL, whatever is available to you.
Where can you go measure that?
You just see your physician and ask for a blood test and say to them, does this test include non-HDL, which most tests routinely should. And you can go the extra step and say, hey, I'd like to order ApoB. Now, they may have a small charge for that. You can work out whether you're prepared to pay that or not, or you can just use the non-HDL, which is, correlates pretty well with ApoB in most circumstances. So I'm just being picky when I'm saying get ApoB. Non-HDL is a pretty damn good predictor of cardiovascular disease. Okay. So moral of the story is to test your levels, know where you're at, and then you can tweak and titrate saturated fat in your diet. We spoke about some of the food swaps that someone might look at before to get to an optimal ApoB level such that when you're walking around in your day-to-day and you're going to bed at night, you're not laying down this fatty plaque in your arteries. That's what we're trying to get to. The principle of science is that context matters, right? Yeah. So I don't see that in fear and say science hasn't worked it out. It's all over the place. Yeah. I say, hey, how can we explain this? And when it is fully explainable, it's not something that you can deliver in one sentence. Yeah. Right? So it requires a bit more of an in-depth discussion. Now, that is different, arguably, though, to what you would say to someone when you're just, if I was sitting down with someone just trying to tell them how to eat, I'm not going into all of those details necessarily. Yeah. I would explain high level what are the characteristics of a healthy dietary pattern, which we did. I'd give them choice. They could choose the one that the variant that they thought they could adhere to best. And then I'd say, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to adopt that diet, and then we're going to measure some things over time. Let's make sure that diet is working for you. We know what biomarkers predict disease. So we start you off with a healthy dietary pattern, and then let's measure some things. Let's look at ApoB. Let's look at fasting glucose, HbA1c, triglycerides, your blood pressure. Let's use those lab tests in addition to using functional tests. Like, let's look at your cardiorespiratory fitness, your strength, these types of things that we know all together, they come together, coalesce to predict your longevity, how well you're going to live. So that's kind of, my overall approach here. But I don't think this is a case of science hasn't worked it out. I think that it's just science showing us that context really matters. Yeah.
But can it work really well cohesively with things like our biology? So do you ever use the argument of how the length of our intestines compared to the length of a lion's intestines, or is that like a moot point for you?
It's not a moot point. I think that stuff is interesting. But I certainly don't think it's anywhere near as compelling as looking at hard health outcomes. When someone does something, what is their risk of having an event? Because that's what we care about.
No, that makes sense.
Are we going to? So I think that there's a whole lot more speculation and extrapolation required to go from anthropology to saying, okay, based on anthropology, we should eat this way. I think you have to make a ton of assumptions. Whereas I think that some of the more refined approaches of science that are looking and trying to control for variables and looking at specific exposures and looking at hard health outcomes and some of the biomarkers that are established as good predictors of disease, I think that's a much more meaningful way to determine what food choices are going to improve our health span the most.
Yeah. I think the concern that people often have is that we might be going in the wrong direction in certain places, like take, for instance, plant milk. So a lot of people have this concern and skepticism about plant milk. Now, it's trendy to think that, you're actually now should be getting milk from your backyard cow. Get a cow and have your own backyard raw milk, and that bottled plant milk is not good for you, doesn't enhance your health. Whereas maybe someone in your realm might be thinking, well, the science shows that when you add supplemental vitamin D to this, for this processed food, because wouldn't plant milk be considered a processed food?
It would be, but I wouldn't say that a processed food inherently is harmful no matter what.
Yeah, not totally. This is not like ultra processed foods, but
we have to essentially almost, I hate using this word, but biohack to get our physiology or help our physiology stay healthy for longer. But to the point about like plant milks, I would agree with some of the skepticism. There are things that I would look out for, like if you were buying plant milks, again, we have to consider, okay, so what is someone taking out of their diet? So if they're taking out dairy, which I said earlier can feature within a healthy dietary pattern, if someone's taking it out, usually that's maybe they're lactose intolerant or for planetary health or animal welfare reasons. If they're removing those foods from their diet, then we want to make sure that they're getting adequate amount of calcium, protein, vitamin D, etc. And also at the same time, ideally they're not swapping for a plant milk that is super loaded with refined sugars. Mm-hmm. So I think you can make sensible swaps, and then you can make swaps that really don't make sense from a nutrition point of view. Yeah. And reading the label is, an important starting point there.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next one, beef liver. What do you think about the hype that beef liver is very good for you and it's a superfood?
If I was eating an only meat diet, then I probably would eat organs.
Okay.
Right? Because they do contain certain nutrients that you wouldn't get otherwise. Mm-hmm. Or it would be very hard to get.
Yeah.
So in that context, sure. But I would also be really aware that if you eat too much, you run the risk of vitamin A toxicity. Some of these are very heavily concentrated. Mm-hmm. And more is not always better. Vitamin A toxicity, excess vitamin A has been linked with various forms of cancer, excess iron. Some of these organs are very rich in iron. Mm-hmm. We know that can cause oxidative stress, is linked with type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So in that particular context, where someone doesn't have fruits and vegetables and is missing out on a bunch of these nutrients, you could create an argument for it. Mm-hmm. But if you're eating an otherwise healthy diet with lots of fruits and vegetables, you don't need organ meats. And
this whole idea of vitamin A toxicity, is the amount that you'd have to eat to reach that point a lot of organ meats, or is it a pretty small
It's very
amount?
highly concentrated. It wouldn't actually be that much. The exact number of grams I'd have to kind of look up. It's not something that I'm looking at every day. But you could easily reach that amount in a week, like exceed the upper limit.
And so why does these other camps, going back to someone like Paul Saladino, is he looking at the evidence differently than you? Or what does he think about the evidence compared to you?
I think he just falls into the naturalistic fallacy. Okay. And is convincing himself that whatever our ancestors ate is best from a longevity point of view, which I've kind of explained I would strongly disagree with.
Yeah.
So he does that, and then he kind of tries to cherry picks evidence to argue against, some of these positions that we've gone through, like cherry pick a phytate study looking at a single feeding thing, or cherry pick a lectin study looking at feeding isolated lectins to mice, but not looking at the actual bigger picture where you're looking at people eating lots of lectin-containing foods having better health outcomes. So largely, we have a different view of the evidence hierarchy. So he's seems to be much more focused in sort of short-term anecdote and ancestral sort of line of thinking. I'm more interested in looking at human exposure, both through observational studies and in clinical trials and meta-analyses of clinical trials. I think that's a much more robust, valid, reliable way of determining what's healthy in the long term.
Right. But something he's done is criticize something like epidemiological studies, but then use an epidemiological study to promote something that he just really wants to
so
believe is good.
He does that a lot. He actually cited that Chen paper that I mentioned before that looks at dairy fats.
Okay.
And that's the one where you can show that dairy was reducing cardiovascular disease risk relative to the types of saturated fat found in red meat. But in the same analysis, they looked at dairy compared to polyunsaturated fats, and that bit was conveniently left out. That people that were eating more polyunsaturated fats had even lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's an example of a logical kind of inconsistency. One, he's not representing that paper completely sort of transparently to the people that he's communicating with. And then secondly, that study is an epidemiological observational study. So you can't take the position elsewhere that epidemiology is terrible, food frequency questionnaires are terrible, yet then find an epidemiology study that you like because it's a food that you like to consume and cite it. That's double standards. That's being inconsistent.
That's really helpful for people to see when they're deciding who to take information from, because, most of the people listening, like myself, we don't know how to read research. So we have to trust the source that we're listening to. So you want to find somebody that's being logically consistent across the board. That's something you're doing very differently than even a lot of the plant-based doctors, willing to admit that, fatty fish could be a potentially better swap than other things. And also, like you said, certain types of dairies, like fermented dairy, that's not something that you're hearing from other plant-based doctors. And it's possible that the biases are coming into play, just like we're accusing this other diet realm of doing. So we picked on ancestral diets a lot this episode.
I kind of feel bad. Sorry,
but there's actually like a lot that you do agree with, like you've said.
And you know what? I really commend anyone that has like just taken the initiative and has the willpower to change their diet and move away from the status quo of a standard diet that's not serving them. I just want people to understand that there are other options and there are tweaks and things that they can do to go to the next level and feel healthier for longer. So I don't want it to seem like I'm picking on the individual. I understand why people adopt these diets, and I understand that people in the short term feel better, and I think that's amazing. I just want people to be aware of some of these other factors maybe that aren't being communicated by the people that they're listening to, so that in 30 years' time, they don't have any regrets there.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what is something specific within the vegan community diet realm?
Shots fired. Are you trying to get me
get you in trouble?
Cancelled from everyone?
Cancelled from both sides.
Where do we start? I think one of the more problematic, and you kind of alluded actually to one thing within the vegan community, is just this kind of general notion that a plant-exclusive vegan diet is the healthiest diet. You can't make that. You cannot make that argument scientifically. It's extremely difficult to do that.
Yeah,
you would have to be very inconsistent in the way that you're looking at evidence. So I think up front, first and foremost, is that animal foods can feature in a healthy diet, and if they're in there, like you said, it probably is leaning more towards fatty fish and kind of fermented types of yogurt and cheese.
And smaller amounts.
Yeah, and smaller amounts. It's a plant-rich diet. Those are not necessarily the hero of the plate. They're more of a kind of side dish. And that diet has been described all the way back, since the early research looking at heart disease that came out of Henry Blackburn and Ansel Keys' work. So I think that's the first thing, is that really the strongest argument to adopt a vegan diet is based on planetary health or animal welfare, particularly animal welfare. And I think what people the trap they fall into is because they're so passionate about animal welfare or planetary health that now let's just go find evidence that's going to create this argument that the vegan diet's the best diet. I don't think you need to do that. I think all you need to be able to explain is that if you adopt a thoughtfully constructed plant-exclusive diet, you can be really healthy. There are some things you need to think about. There are some nutrients of focus. Every single diet has limitations. Let's air them. Let's be aware of the limitations. Let's adopt it in a way where it's optimized, and then it's in line with the values that you have. So that's the first thing. The second is, I'd say, like, when you sort of drill down a bit more specifically into the construction of a plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of fading, but there has been a message for low-fat vegan diets.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really been a big fan of that. And there's a few reasons. One, I think that it often leads to people consuming insufficient calories. Mm-hmm. And I've worked with enough women to see that on such diets where they're super low in fat, particularly if they're an active person, then they're consuming insufficient calories, it can really mess with their hormones. Mm-hmm. They can lose their period.
Yeah, which messes your fertility.
Right. So all sorts of a cascade of things can occur if you're adopting a diet that's not nourishing you and providing you with enough energy. Yeah. And that can happen when you go super low fat. It's very low calorie density. It's high volume food. Mm-hmm. And if you're not a big eater, you can fall into that trap.
Also because it's just not as delicious. Right. Like when you're not eating food that's as delicious, it's hard to eat enough calories from it. So
now the flip side of that is, where these diets, where we've kind of made an error, is that there are studies showing that those diets can be really good for someone with really poor metabolic health who needs to lose a lot of weight. Mm-hmm. That's a different context to a woman in her 30s, right?
Yeah.
Who's at a completely different life stage. She's metabolically healthy. She's active. Maybe she wants to have kids, all that sort of stuff. So I don't like low fat because from the perspective for certain people, it can lead to energy restriction. It can affect your absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, so A, D, E, and K, which can be problematic. And perhaps most importantly, it's limiting polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, which I think the evidence clearly shows are inherently beneficial. These are not compounds that we want to avoid. We actually want them to be in our diet because they keep us insulin sensitive. They drive down ApoB, which means we're getting less of that fatty plaque building up in the arteries. So they're probably like the big ticket items where I would disagree with people in the vegan community. I'm sure there's more, but those are the big ones.
Do you know where they got this concept that we should be eating lower fat?
It's from studies like Dean Ornish's Lifestyle Heart study, which was looking at people with, it's a secondary prevention study. So they have these are sick people that have heart disease, they're overweight. In that circumstance, you kind of need to throw everything at it. Yeah. And it's a very different context to the average person who's thinking about adopting a plant-based diet. Yeah. So I think what's happened is those studies came out, mainly the Dean Ornish one, also Esselstyn's study, which we could talk about that for a long time, but that's not actually a controlled trial. It's more of a case study. It's very hard to deduce any solid findings from that. But Dean Ornish's his clinical trial, which again, it's not just diet. They also stopped smoking. They started exercising. They did stress reduction. So a little bit hard to say it's just the diet. But the dietary intervention nonetheless was low fat. And so what happened off the back of that was, a lot of books and a lot of articles and a lot of conferences, people talking about low fat being the best for heart disease. And, somehow that's been generalized just to everyone doing that. But the issue with that is, firstly, the type of people that they were studying were quite sick. But secondly, we have other evidence, clinical trials that have looked at low-fat diets versus higher fat diets, but with a bias for unsaturated fats. And there's a recent one called the Cardio-Prev. This is a 7-year randomized controlled trial. And this trial, unlike the Dean Ornish one, the only thing they changed was diet. So you get a much better look at the actual inherent benefits of diet. Now, some people might argue that the low-fat version wasn't low enough, but still it was much lower than the group who were having higher fat, but from olive oil and unsaturated fat sources. Over 7 years, what happened? Who did better? The low-fat diet? And these were both healthy, whole food diets. Who does better? Low-fat or the high-fat with the unsaturated fat bias? The latter. The high-fat, unsaturated fat bias had significantly less cardiovascular disease. They had better flow mediated dilation, which means their arteries were actually operating better, and they had less plaque build up in their carotid artery. So they had regression of any plaque that was in there. So I think that, we can't ignore evidence like that. There's and that's not the only bit of evidence. There's other clinical trials that speak to these unsaturated fats being inherently beneficial. So, I like to communicate that so that people don't see fat as like we don't have to demonize fat. We need to understand that fat is an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. And even how I explained before, saturated fat's an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. But if we just simplify and we say fat's an umbrella term, underneath it you have saturated fats, you have monounsaturated fats, and you have polyunsaturated fats. Rather than thinking about like restricting total fat, think about the quality of the fats you're eating. Mm-hmm. What foods are providing the fats?
Yeah.
And if those foods tend to be fatty fish, if you eat seafood, or nuts and seeds, tofu and avocado and olive oil or avocado oil, things of that nature, then those fats are completely healthy for you and you shouldn't fear them.
Yes, I love that. I love my avocado. I eat so much avocado in my diet and it makes me feel so good. And I think that it is definitely a part of a healthy diet specifically for women. Like you said, women in their fertility age it's so important and healthful to eat healthy amounts of fats. And I think really considering about how one of the main reasons why so many people or why people often stop eating plant-based is often they're not eating enough calories, and it's a lot harder to get enough calories when you're not eating healthy fat sources. Mm-hmm. So that's a really important to talk about. I'm glad you brought that up. So just kind of to round it out, what is the point of all this? Is it longevity? Is it feeling your best in the current moment? And I think that could just be like an individual answer for people. But is it, when you're looking at science, is it anything other than just longevity? Is it also feeling good right now? Or does the science show that that longevity and feeling good right now are cohesive?
They're cohesive. But I also think this probably requires like a bit of a deeper philosophical examination
totally.
to this question, right? So like, why do we want to live longer? And I read a study recently, and it was looking at people before they were dying and what their biggest regrets were. Their biggest regret was that they didn't live the life that they wanted to live. They lived the life that others wanted them to live.
Oh, wow.
So I think if we're going to have this conversation about longevity, first and foremost, it's examining, why do we love life? Are we living the life that we want to live? And when we are, and you feel that, of course you want to live for as long as possible.
Yes.
Right? So we I think we reframe that rather than just this scientific pursuit of just living long. Yeah. Right? We really want to live better, and not just physically, but emotionally. And so getting clear on like, why do we want to do that? It's going to be a little bit different for each person. I think that's kind of the starting point. And then that can kind of hold people to some of these things that we've been discussing, and behavior change, and building it into becoming a lifestyle with a bit more meaning.
Yes, totally. And it helps look at it at a holistic perspective too, that it's not just about food, feeling good, longevity. It's so clearly not just about food. Right.
I've got these retreats at the end of this year, and the whole focus is on it's on like longevity optimization, right? And going into it, I was thinking like, what can I impart on the people that are coming? Like, how can I be most effective here? And to your point that it's not just nutrition. Like, nutrition is just not a tiny, but it's a chunk of what we're going to be exploring. But we're really going to teach people about all of the different biomarkers and predictors of longevity, and then how to intervene on that through nutrition, through exercise and movement, which we haven't spoken about, but that's, a huge part here, through stress reduction and practices to improve your emotional health and happiness. All of this really matters at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is a great way to end this conversation. We touched on so much. A lot of your conversations on your podcast can get quite long too, right? Because you're honing on like a specific, you could do a whole episode on ApoB.
I think 4 hours is the longest.
4 hours, that's super long.
That was a debate. That was actually a debate on seed oils.
Oh, I watched that one.
Seed oils versus saturated fat.
Yeah, and you moderated it.
I moderated.
I watched that one. Definitely some of it went over my head, but it was very interesting.
Yeah.
I love debates. I think debates are the best. But thank you so much for being here. We've had such a great time with you so far. We have a few more days till you leave, and
looking forward to getting a surf in today.
Yes, totally.
But it's a pleasure. I've loved it. And thanks for opening up your home and hanging out. I love your kids. Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. They love
Andrew.
you.
So it's been amazing, and I just feel grateful that you invited me.
So awesome. Well, thanks for being here. We're going to end it right now.